I mean, one thing that really comes across listening to you guys is the need to be strategic and to think long term. And Shannon, during season 4 of Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, you talked about your 3-year plan for walkthroughs. What would you describe as the principles underpinning sort of your approach to change management over an extended period? And I think that question can go out to everyone, but I don't know if we can start with you, Shannon.
So this is something that I spoke about at Research Ed recently, and there are sort of 3 principles or kind of takeaways that I gave the people that came to my talk. And the first one was you have to get the culture right. So you need to try and build that trust, and that trust does come with time, but you have to try and convince your staff first and foremost that this is not the new kind of thing to beat the teachers with. It's actually going to develop them. Find some early adopters, some keen people, and that will help you get the buy-in and get the leaders on board, because you need them to help with the buy-in as well. And then you've got to lay the foundations. You need to go slowly. You can't rush in all guns blazing. You have to ensure that everyone, as much as possible, is on the same page as you. So, you know, walkthroughs has been designed for instructional coaching, but we knew there was no point in us starting instructional coaching if we didn't have that base level of understanding of what good teaching looked like, and that we were speaking the same language. And so we had to let people explore first, which is part of that EEF implementation guide. You know, that explore step is really important, because then you can prepare, deliver, sustain. And then the third one being, you have to do what you can to develop that appetite amongst staff. So you have to make it exciting. You have to kind of show them the possibilities and kind of hint to how far you can push it and how exciting this can be for them, and how much, you know, they could take their development into their own hands. And you need to start letting people flirt with the idea of choosing their own path. So there might be whole school priorities, and there probably always will be. And some of, you know, your teacher development work, your professional development will be solving those whole school learning problems, but some of it will be individual as well. And you want teachers to start being able to identify their own things that they need to work on. And that kind of being given the ownership of that should help them kind of get that hunger for it. So yeah, culture, foundations, appetite were my principles.
Love that. Love that. Wish I'd been able to see your talk. Really wish I'd been. We were on at the same time, so that's just how the cookie crumbles. But so yeah, I think you've covered a lot of really important stuff there. I think part of this as well, and this has been touched on earlier, prioritization, working out, taking the time to work out what exactly is it that matters most to this school right now in terms of its teaching and learning. And of course, that's going to be different to every school. It doesn't just relate to what the school is struggling with or could improve on. It's also what stuff you think is the highest leverage. So if the school isn't particularly great at something that doesn't feel quite as important as, say, formative assessment, you go with formative assessment, because that's just that's a big deal. If you're not getting formative assessment right, you can argue that, well, that's the heart of teaching. You can't really be teaching well if formative assessment isn't used well across the school. So prioritization, I think alongside that, again, Lloyd touched on this earlier, how are you balancing, and you did as well, Shannon, how are you balancing this idea of whole school priorities with individual priorities? There are ways to do that, a way that explicitly gives time for both of those things through a kind of a routine of moving between those priorities, which I think is fantastic. A bit of a hobby horse of mine, not losing sight of subject knowledge and the links to pedagogical content knowledge that obviously kind of go with that. I talk about it a lot. Secondary, the conversation is often secondary led, and I don't think that's anyone's fault particularly. It's just that there's some really, really impressive voices when it comes to professional development that come from the secondary side of this conversation. There are some impressive voices on the primary side as well, but sometimes we can be, I say we, I'm not backwards in coming forwards, but I think in some cases there's a sense that we don't feel we can talk for the profession in the same way that secondary teachers can. Anyway, long way round to say, primary schools can have a much bigger deal when it comes to subject knowledge. We have to make sure that we bear this in mind, because we are less likely to be experts in our areas. So making sure that that's part of professional development is a big deal. Ideally, embedding room for maneuver between experts in a given area and relative novices and those in between. You might deliver some professional development or be about to support some teachers with the professional development where you think, actually, this teacher, and it might be a relatively new teacher, it might be someone who's very experienced, but you think, actually, they know this stuff and they know it well enough that I would prefer them to support me with the creation and delivery of this professional development and the support of their peers, rather than just be kind of on the learning end of it. So there being that room to take advantage of the expertise that's in the school, and that bit of flexibility. And yeah, the other priority would be involving SLT. If they're not on board, if they're not attending, if they don't feel that they need to know this stuff as well, it sends a really bad message. And I think it really undermines what's going on.
I saw Matthew Clark and Sarah Cottingham having a little chat on Twitter the other day. It's off the back of Sam Sims and Sarah Cottingham event they did at the research school in Kent. And in her, usual form, Sarah just came up with a one line, which was just stunning. And it just sums up, I think, what you just said. Change management or approach to change lives and dies depending on the environment. And that's it, isn't it? It lives and dies depending on the environment. And if the environment isn't right, so like Shannon said, you can forget it. Like you can have the most fandangle, beautifully research engaged and informed thing. It just won't land because it's the culture's not right. That's not right. So how do we do that? How do we move from into that? Well, you've got to explain why, haven't you? It comes back to why, that we've said it a million times before on the podcast, explaining why you are doing everything you do in your school. Like, why are we doing this? Because this is what we're doing. And you outline it and you paint that picture for teachers. You focus the lens of change, I would say it as. You focus the lens of change for the long term, right? Because otherwise, it's blurry for teachers. They don't really know why you're going down that way. You need clarity. So, and you have to and that's part of getting that environment right, I would say. I would argue that a phased approach towards it is probably the best way of doing it, because again, going back to that idea of prudence and that idea of less is more, because you're trying to chase all the rabbits, you'll catch none. And that thinking in teaching has not been very fashionable for a long time. There's a legacy of get it done yesterday thinking, which I understand where that's come from. It's come from various stakeholders and various that's a whole nother podcast like for another day, like why that came to be. But it's driven this culture in schools where it's ridiculous. Like you can't when you step back and look at what you're trying to do and ask a busy hardworking teacher to do, you think that's nuts. Like that is that they're not gonna, none of that's going to land. Like, and I don't know why it took me so long to realize that. And I'm very grateful. Again, I know I've said about my national professional qualification, I talk about them all the time, but I am very grateful for them, because that has really sharpened my thinking around that. And I've sort of gone, what was I, even, when I joined Staples, what was I doing in that first couple of years? But like Chris says, the schools are in different positions, different priorities take precedent, and knowing what they are is really, really key. I think one of the last things I'll mention before we move on is time and structure. So like for change to happen, it needs to be given the correct amount of time. It needs to be protected, and that systematic structural protection of that time within the school is absolutely fundamental, because if it's not there, again, it feeds into the environment. The environment's not right. It all kind of into this organic thing. It will not work if a super busy subject leader is being asked to do this on a Tuesday night when they're absolutely knackered after a day of, it's not going to happen, because they are going to be waning, because they're exhausted, rightly so, and because teaching's hard, and we need to protect that. We really do. So yeah, I think, the environment, explaining the why, having that phased approach, being strategic, and carving out the time and the systems and the structure in your school as well.
Yeah, I think more in the culture. I think sort of one of the things that I think has been really important for me and talking to the teacher development needs in the schools that we've got in our trust has been putting your money where your mouth is and saying, these are the things that are important to us now, and dropping other things. And so one of my big ones was sort of one-off formal lesson observations that went nowhere, didn't impact people's teaching, didn't develop them professionally, and just were meaningless, let's face it. And several of our schools have dropped them and have gone for the learning walk approach. And we are finding our feet with how that works and how that works with appraisal. But that was a really big step for me, I think, to gain the trust and to get that culture right, and for the teachers to see that this wasn't an accountability model. Because if we'd carried on with formal lesson observations, but being like, but your professional development is important and we're investing in you and we want this continuous thing and it's collaborative, but carried on with that, it wouldn't have worked in the way it's worked this year. And I'm not saying it's been perfect, but we've got so many staff on board by making sort of bold moves like that and saying, actually, we don't stand for that. That's not what we're about anymore. So we need to get rid of it. And so I think putting your money where your mouth is early on has been a really big thing for us.
I saw, I think it was a Chris Moyes thread where he was talking about the fact that in 2022, people are still grading lessons. I mean, that must be the most, if it's true, the most ridiculous thing I've heard, because we know how hard it is to actually get an accurate, no, not even accurate, to get an agreement. You know, so I didn't follow the whole thread, but I was having a conversation and I really couldn't believe it. So, you know, if there's still schools who are grading lessons, please stop, because you can't.